Welcome to the Heidi Thorne Show. I'm your host, Heidi Thorne, and in this podcast, I share with you my real-world self-publishing and small business experience. So let's get started with today's show. Now, I love this time of year. And the reason I love it is because the fall season of Shark Tank is coming back on the air. Now, for those of you who don't know what Shark Tank is, it's a reality competition show where entrepreneurs pitch their business idea to venture capital investors to try and get venture capital. And I was thinking about this as an author. And we are like entrepreneurs. In fact, many of us are entrepreneurs. And we need to be thinking about our books in a more entrepreneurial fashion. So I thought, what if your book was up for consideration on Shark Tank? Now, I've had other authors in my community, and they get so bummed out when their pitch to a traditional publisher just doesn't get accepted, or their book isn't selling. And the reason being is they haven't answered a lot of questions that an investor, whether it be a traditional publisher investor or a reader, they haven't answered the right questions. So let's look at the traditional publishing thing first. Now, here are some of the questions that they would ask you as a Shark Tank-like investor when they are a publisher. First, how would you describe your business or product in a few words? Now, usually this description, as the people come into the Shark Tank on the show, the narrator goes through that as they come into the tank. And this would be like your query letter. How could you describe what your book concept is in a few words? Now, the next question is, who is the ideal customer for this product, meaning your book? Now, an investor wants to know who would be reading your book. A lot of authors just don't even think about that question. And I just find that amazing, because when you are an author, you are in sales. I hate to break it to you, but that's the truth. So you really have to know who your ideal customer reader is. And a traditional publisher, or like a venture capital investor, would also want to know, how big is the market? How many of these ideal customers are out there? And for some niche genres or topics, it might be very small. And in that case, the traditional publisher might pass on your book because there's just not enough money to be made. Now, have you made any actual sales of the product or a similar previous product? So maybe you've self-published a book earlier. They want to know how it did on sales. Or if you were a traditional published author, maybe you can tell them how your other books have done in the marketplace. They want to see if you have a track record in the writing business. And if you have sold any of the product, whether it's on your own or through a traditional publisher, who is it being sold to? How is it being sold? And how is it actually being sold? Is it online? Is it through your website? Is it through an Amazon? Is it through traditional retailers? They want to know how the sales are going. And a traditional publisher, or like a venture capital investor, would want to know how soon they're going to make their money back. Is this a hot topic right now in the marketplace? And sometimes it takes a long time to traditionally publish a book. So they need to know how that trend is going for books like yours. And they want to know also, what other books like yours are in the marketplace? If you don't know who your competition is, that's a bad sign, because you don't know how you fit into the marketplace. So you want to know what is a similar book to yours that's already in the marketplace. And here's the big one. They want to know what is the size of your author platform? And that means, what is your social media following? What is your website like? Do you have an email list? They want to know how you're building fans for your book, because that is the most valuable thing that they want from you. They want to have a built-in audience. Now, I had a friend who had a big social media following, and publishers approached her to do a book because they wanted her following. So the other question they'll want to know is, what uniquely qualifies you to write this book and present it to the marketplace? Do you have particular experience in this? How are you an expert in this field? And you have to understand that you're not selling a traditional publisher or even an agent on your book. You are selling them on you and your book and your ability to help them make a buck. There are a lot of good authors out there. You're just one of many. So you want to go through those questions I just gave you to see how your book stacks up in terms of being saleable to a venture capital investor like a traditional publisher. And one of the things that I've found with authors is that good book writers are horrible copywriters. They don't know how to write marketing copy for their books. They're just absolutely horrible at it because they think in big, big, big expanses of words. If they've written maybe a 50 or 60 or maybe even 100,000 word book, it's hard for them to condense their ideas into small chunks, like 100 words, 200 words, 300 words. Now, a good exercise for this is to think like a screenwriter. Now, in the screenwriting business, there's something called a logline. Now, the logline is the concept of your book in like 1 or 2 sentences. So you have to take your book and you have to write maybe in 25 words or less what your book is about. Could you do it? I will bet a lot of authors can't. So that is a super exercise for trying to think more like a copywriter than a novelist or even a nonfiction writer. Think in little bite-sized chunks that will be on tweets and Facebook posts and that sort of thing, so that people understand what your book is in a couple of seconds. I've also found that a lot of authors are way, way, way too close to their work in order to be objective. So they can't really even think about their book in terms of a saleable product. So that is when an editor or beta reader can really be of help. And you want to ask your critique editor or your beta readers, how would you describe this book in a log line, like in 25 words or less? How would you describe it? And that will give you some great insight into what your book is all about. Now, you also want to be thinking about your reader's needs instead of your needs. Your needs is to sell the book and make lots of money and become a famous author. But really, you have to be thinking about who's going to buy your book. Now, whether it's a traditional publisher or getting representation from an agent, or your readers if you're self-published. So you really need to be thinking about their needs and not yours. That should be obvious, but I've been surprised at how many of people don't think about that, especially in the self-published arena. They just don't think about who their readers are and how they're going to sell the book to these readers. Now, The one thing that I found too is that some authors think this is a short-term game. Now, whether you go traditional publishing or self-publishing, this is a long, long process. If you're self-publishing, it could take months, literally months. And I know I'll talk about this again in some other episode. It can take months to properly self-publish a book. It doesn't happen overnight, even though the upload process and getting it on Kindle Direct Publishing or wherever you're publishing it could be really fast. It's all the lead up to that takes so much time. And for those of you who are trying to get a book deal, the query process where you're approaching either a publisher or an agent could be years in the making. And if you're not ready for that emotionally or financially, you have to really think about whether you want to do this or not, and whether this is a career for you or maybe just a fun hobby. So a lot of questions to think about, and you have to really think about your book as an investment. So I hope you found these tips helpful as you think about your book. And if you did find it helpful, I would appreciate it if you would go over to iTunes and leave a nice rating for the podcast. And also, for the video podcast version of this, please leave some comments or likes on YouTube. I would really appreciate that. Also, subscribe on iTunes or YouTube so you don't miss an episode of the Heidi Thorne Show. And also, if you're interested in connecting with me or my books, my website is HeidiThorne.com, and my books are on Amazon. You just have to search for Heidi Thorne, and you'll find my author page, and all of my books, ebooks and audiobooks, are listed there. My audiobooks are also available on Audible and iTunes. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll look forward to talking to you to the next time. In the meantime, have a great day.